Let's assume that last episode, we were wrong about the government being a dominant class. For a moment, let's agree with those who Kropotkin called the utopians of authority, or people that believe that authority won't be used to oppress others. Even then, more questions arise. What purpose would this government serve that communities couldn't? How would a government strengthen solidarity? Let's find out. My name is Sean, and welcome to Germinal. Malatesta goes back to the image of the bound man from chapter 1. We are used to living under a government which takes over all that energy, intelligence, and will which it can direct for its own ends, and it hinders, paralyzes, and suppresses those who do not serve its purpose or are hostile, and we think that everything that is done in society is carried out thanks to the government, and that without the government there would no longer be any energy, intelligence, or goodwill left in society. It's as if we believe that without a master, we can't feed ourselves because the masters monopolize private property. We also believe that without a government, we can't organize because the government monopolizes the instruments of solidarity. The landowner doesn't create food out of nothing. We can produce food without him. The government doesn't organize out of nothing. We can organize ourselves without it. In other words, the government uses the moral and material forces already present in society. It doesn't create them. It can't create forces out of nothing. All it can do is use the force in society that already exists. This can throw us into a discussion on what makes society's progress: individual initiative or social action. Does it come from individuals or the collectivity, or we could say the government? Malatesta says that the question is a bit misguiding. It is in the organism of every individual that all thoughts and human actions inevitably have their origin, and from being individual, they become collective thoughts and acts when they are or become accepted by many individuals. Social action, therefore, is neither the negation nor the complement of individual initiative, but is the resultant of initiatives, thoughts, and actions of all individuals who make up society. So, with or without a government, social progress comes from individuals. There is no need for a government to initiate that progress. Furthermore, the government could actually be slowing that progress down. And if instead, as do the authoritarians, one means government action when one talks of social action, then this is still the resultant of individual forces, but only of those individuals who form the government or who, by reason of their position, can influence the policy of the government. Under a government, a society will only progress from the forces of a small amount of individuals, the governors, which is extremely far from a society progressing from the forces of all individuals. So hopefully now you understand that when anarchists speak of liberty, they don't mean becoming more independent from society or freeing themselves from social constraints, but rather it is a question of preventing some individuals from oppressing others, of giving all individuals the same rights and the same means of action, and of replacing the initiative of the few, which inevitably results in the oppression of everybody else. It is, after all, a question of destroying once and for all the domination and exploitation of man by man, so that everyone can have a stake in the common well and individual forces, instead of being destroyed or fighting among themselves or being cut off from each other, will find the possibility of complete fulfillment and come together for the greater benefit of everybody. So, if we go back to the utopians of authority, even if the government wasn't a privileged class, it would still reduce the potential of the productive, organizing, and protective forces of society because they only take into account the forces coming from the governors. If non-governmental forces of society demand a change, then the government will oppose it until this demand is thoroughly fought for. Malatesta quotes French historian Jean de Sismondi on that thought. The state is always a conservative power which legalizes, regularizes, and organizes the victories of progress, but never introduces them. These victories are always started down below. They are born in the heart of society. From individual thought, which is then spread far and wide, becomes opinion, the majority, but in making its way, it must always meet with and combat in the powers that be, tradition, habit, privilege, and error. We have seen this from women's suffrage to the civil rights movement and LGBTQ+ rights. But this is not only applicable for the defense of minority rights. The fight for cannabis legalization in Canada, for example, started down below, with governments slowing that progress down. But one government did finally concede and legalized, regularized, and organized the victories of that progress. Now, some may think that it's because of the government that such progress was made, but we could argue that it was actually made in spite of the government. Alright, so governments are bad, but how would society work without a government? Well, look around you. Most of our social activities don't come from the government. Work, barter, study, travel, and moral rules in general. When the government does intervene, it usually adds unnecessary steps which renders the social activity more difficult. On a large scale, governmentless cooperation also happens with large associations spreading across countries, such as capitalist corporations or other associations which, inspired by a love of one's fellow beings, or by a passion for science, or more simply by the desire to enjoy oneself and to be applauded, are more representative of the groupings as they will be in a society in which, having abolished private property and the internecine struggle between men, everybody will find his interest in that of everybody else, and his greatest satisfaction in doing good and in pleasing others. Malatesta argues that all aspects of society could be organized that way if it wasn't for the obstacles imposed by governments, the dissensions created by private property, and the discouragement felt by most people as a result of the seizure of all wealth by a few. In other words, in a society that promotes competition and discourages this kind of association, it won't happen. As we have said earlier, the government doesn't create out of nothing. If the government didn't take care of the postal service, for example, people would organize and do it. The government adds nothing. And the more the need is universal and urgent, the more volunteers will there be to carry it out. If the people had the power to deal with the problems of production and food supplies, oh, have no fear that they might just die of hunger waiting for a government to make the necessary laws to deal with the problem. People don't need a government to work, cooperate, and eat. They won't let themselves starve. Not only that, but they will carry out these jobs more productively. If we do things now which only interest a few, we will do them that much better and more intensively when they will be of interest to everybody. Add to that the fact that the workplace would be democratic and people would work to strengthen their community, not out of fear of starvation. Remember, if people work and allow themselves to be exploited, it's to feed themselves. But let's get to one of my personal favorite parts of this book, the answer to the following question. Without a government, how could a society defend itself if it doesn't have a police force or a justice system? Many suppose that if there were no carabiners, policemen, and judges, everyone would be free to kill, to ravish, to harm others as the mood took one, and that anarchists, in the name of their principles, would wish to see that strange liberty respected which violates and destroys the freedom and life of others. Of course, this is absurd. We believe that in a society with no private property, where the needs of everyone would be taken care of, when competition is traded for cooperation, the reasons which make people act immorally, often stemming from poverty, would disappear. There would therefore be a lot less violence in an anarchist society because we'd be eliminating the roots of evil. But supposing that as a result of the kind of education received from present society, or for physical misfortune, or for any other reason, someone were to want to do harm to us and to others, one can be sure that we would exert ourselves to prevent him from so doing with all the means at our disposal. Of course, because we know that man is the consequence of his own organism, as well as of the cosmic and social environment in which he lives, because we do not confuse the inviolable right of defense with the claimed ridiculous right to punish, and since with the delinquent, that is, with he who commits antisocial acts, we would not, to be sure, see the rebel slave as happens with the judges today, but the sick brother needing treatment, so would we not introduce hatred in the repression, and would make every effort not to go beyond the needs of defense, and would not think of avenging ourselves, but of seeking to cure, redeem the unhappy person with all the means that science offered us. The quote is pretty self-explanatory. Anarchist societies will defend themselves against antisocial acts, but they would see antisocial acts like we would today see an illness. If your conditions, mental or social, pushed you to believe that crime was what you should do, then something is wrong and we should try to fix what's wrong, not punish. Crime is not the problem, but the symptom of a problem. Anyhow, Malatesta also argues that unwritten laws, such as customs, not being regulated by the government, are better followed because they're socially enforced by the community. Because they don't rely on an external force, the government, to apply these rules, the community does it itself, and it's super effective. Malatesta gives the example of desert caravans in Africa, where water is so precious it can't be wasted. Wasting water isn't illegal, but people understand the custom and know that it's regulated by their close ones. The social consequences of wasting water are again very effective. Malatesta continues, "Is it perhaps because of the gendarmes that more people are not killed? In most of the villages in Italy, the gendarmes are only seen from time to time. Millions of people cross the mountains and pass through the countryside far from the protecting eye of authority, such that one could strike them down without the slightest risk of punishment, yet they are no less safe than those who live in the most protected areas. And statistics show that the number of crimes is hardly affected by repressive measures, whereas it changes dramatically with changes in economic conditions and in the attitudes of public opinion." So, the government and its police force claim to be protecting the security of individuals, but at the same time, protect private property. Yet, private property concentrates wealth in the hands of a few, creating economic conditions which stimulate crime, risking the security of individuals. It's almost as if the government and the police force try to fight crime while protecting a system which encourages crime. So yeah, the government doesn't help when it comes to preventing crimes. Its justice system is, in its essence, unfair as it privileges a small part of the population. Anatole France, a French poet, wrote this simple yet very telling line. "The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread." We'll end this episode here. See you next time, where we'll continue to see how anarchism would work if it was to be applied in a society.